Well, hello everybody and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DeCosta and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me. Hope you have all enjoyed my last couple of offerings. Just kind of been thinking about these things a little bit more lately. And so I wanted to share some things and kind of get it off the old chest. And I find that sometimes when I'm away from the good book for a while, take a little hiatus, kind of, focus on other things. When I come back, it's usually more clear. It's usually, I step away and kind of see things a little different or see things not differently, but just see things, better and clearer than I had in the past. So as I'm going through some of these topics, just thinking about how clear this is to me, one that comes to mind quite often is the whole fullness of the nations, aka fullness of the Gentiles, Paul in Romans 11. And I don't think that people actually have a broad enough view of the story. In other words, they're kind of like compartmentalized in the Old Testament and as well in the New. And there's not really much consideration for how they relate to each other, right? Because if you took more of an aerial shot of the Bible, you could see that in the very beginning, there's promises made about a certain people group becoming a fullness of nations. And then in the end, we have promises or fulfillments by Paul towards the last days, again, calling to attention these people who have become a fullness of nations or, a magnitude or a multitude of nations, right? So you have in the beginning, you have sort of the foundation, the promise, the prediction, if you will. And then at the very end, you have that same language being used and Paul calling to remembrance all these Old Testament prophetic texts and statements and promises. And I have to wonder and ask myself if people are really, even on the same planet as me sometimes when they argue that this is not about Israel in the New Testament being gathered in. Right? So a couple places that you can kind of look just to prove this, and obviously if you've been here a while, I don't have to say much to you, but some of the better proof texts come from this point here regarding Joseph and his sons Ephraim and Manasseh. So we know the story in Genesis chapter 48 where Jacob is getting old and he's sick and he was going to die soon. And Joseph brings his children to them. And Jacob says, "Bring them to me, and I will bless them." And so the eyes of Jacob were dim so that he could not see. And so Joseph brought them near. And then it looks like, let's see, I'm just reading through it here, just refreshing my memory because it's been a while. I'm a little rusty, but Ephraim with his right hand towards Israel, Manasseh with his left. Israel stretches out his right hand and lays it on Ephraim's head, who was the younger, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, who was the older. For Manasseh was the firstborn, and he blessed Joseph and said, "God, before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked, the God who has fed me all my life, the angel who has redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads. Let my name be named upon them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and let them grow into a multitude in the midst of the earth." So there you have this prayer asking, or Jacob asking, saying, let these ones grow to a multitude beyond number. And then when Joseph saw that his father laid his right hand on the head of Ephraim, it displeased him, so he took his hand to remove it. And Joseph said to his father, "Not so, for this is the firstborn. Put your hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He shall also become a great people, and he shall be great. But truly his younger brother shall be greater than he, and his descendants shall become a multitude of nations." So we have this promise here from Jacob with his hand on Ephraim's head, basically saying this one will become a multitude of nations. I mean, literally, that is what we see in the last days of the New Testament, that fulfillment coming to fruition. A multitude, a fullness of nations is being gathered in according to the promise that was made by God to their fathers. Okay? That's why we hear them called as the elect. And so he blessed them that day, and then Israel said to Joseph, "Behold, I am dying, but God will be with you and bring you back to the land of your fathers." So in Genesis 48, we have some foundational stuff that we really need to take notice of, that being the language that Ephraim would become a multitude of nations, a fullness of nations, a multitude of people in the midst of the earth. So why are we not taking more notice of that foundational promise and considering it, really, honestly considering it as a valid option for the elect ones being gathered in the end? Now, people have questions about the 12 tribes. They say, how does it work? Why is Ephraim and Manasseh kind of a double off of Joseph and all this, that, and the other? And I saw at one point a rabbi somewhere say, and I kind of agree with it, that since, Jacob treated Joseph as his firstborn, and it shows Joseph being split into the two tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh, and that should or could reflect the double portion law that the firstborn should receive. So even though it seems like there's a 13th tribe, it's actually still 12 because the 12 the firstborn gets a double portion. And that comes from, you can see that in Deuteronomy 21. It says, "But he shall acknowledge the firstborn by giving him a double portion of all that he have, for he is the beginning of his strength, the right of his firstborn is his." So it could just be that Joseph being, the firstborn is getting a double portion, hence why you have the two tribes. But I'm sure there's varying, opinions on that. But the point is that we have some serious language here correlating to Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh was going to become great as well, but Ephraim was going to become this great multitude in all the earth, fullness of nations, whatever you prefer to call it. So we have that there, okay? Now, if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 33, we see that this is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. And so Moses has a final blessing on Israel before he dies. And he goes through and he says, Moses, everyone receives your words. Moses commanded a law for us. This is Israel, a heritage of the congregation of Israel. And he was king. When the leaders of the people were gathered, all the tribes of Israel gathered together. And then this is what he said: "Let Reuben live and not die, nor let his men be few." And this he said of Judah: "Hear, Lord, the voice of Judah, and bring him to his people. Let his hands be sufficient, and you may help against his enemies." And of Levi he said, "Let your blah, 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 blah." Okay? And of Benjamin he said, okay? So he's going through the tribes, and he's saying a little ditty about each of the tribes. And look at in verse 13 when he comes to Joseph. Look what he says. He says, Blessed of the Lord is his land, with the precious things of heaven and the dew, and the deep lying beneath, with the precious fruits of the sun, with the precious produce of the months, with the best things of the ancient mountains, yada, 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 and the favor of him who dwelt in the bush. Let the blessing come on the head of Joseph, and on the crown of the head of him who was separate from his brothers. You know the story. He goes on in verse 17. He says, "His glory is like a firstborn bull." There's that firstborn. "And his horns like the horns of the wild ox." Here it is. "Together with them he shall push the peoples to the ends of the earth. They are the 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh." So here we have Moses on his deathbed basically giving a blessing to each of the tribes. And he gets to Joseph, who's the firstborn, who got the double portion for Ephraim and Manasseh, double portion of the land inheritance. And what does Moses say? Well, he says that he, Joseph, will push the peoples to the ends of the earth. So again, why aren't people at least honestly considering, at least taking a look at this stuff? Because in the beginning here, when Moses is about to die, we have a promise that the descendants of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, obviously part of the 12 tribes, would actually be pushed to the ends of the earth, and they are the, quote, 10,000s of Ephraim, and they are the thousands of Manasseh. And that fits perfectly with Genesis 48, doesn't it? Because we know that Manasseh was said to get a blessing. His blessing, they will be great, he said. But his younger brother Ephraim will be greater than he in terms of number. And that is exactly what it says. It says Ephraim would be 10,000s and Manasseh would be thousands. So again, we need to consider what's being said here, because we have literally the exact same things being spoken of in the foundational components of this story. At the origins of this story, we have the exact same things promised that we see being fulfilled in the end of the story. Paul says that when the fullness of the nations, same words, same phrase, same terms, never used to speak of anyone else, but when the fullness of the nations comes in this way, all Israel will be saved. Now, why would that have to be? Well, because of what I just shared with you. The promise was that the peoples of Ephraim and Manasseh, a.k.a. one of the tribes of Israel, the double portion off of Joseph, the peoples of the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, the 10,000s and the thousands, would need to be saved as well, because all Israel could not be saved unless they were saved as well, and they were pushed to the ends of the earth. And this is why Jesus gave the gospel mission and said, go to the ends of the earth and take it. I will give you the helper. And when the helper landed on them and marked them out and gave them powers and they knew that they were them, Paul says that it was because they were Abraham's seed and heirs according to promise in Galatians. So again, this whole thing is connected. I don't care what anybody says. It's connected, period. You have no argument. Okay? People come on, and I'm getting a lot of the Hebrew Israelite crowd lately, and they come on, and they probably don't even listen to what I say, because they usually just start off with, we are Israel. We must avoid pork. We must obey the 10 Commandments. Like, it's just me, right? It's a different type of delusion because they're unaware of the fulfillment that takes place in the New Testament. They haven't connected it yet. They'll get there if they listen to stuff like this, right? But the point that this video is trying to make is regarding the fullness of the nations, right? Why on earth would Paul be speaking of something completely different than what Deuteronomy and Genesis is speaking of? Why would the fullness of the nations in Paul be any different than the fullness of the nations in Deuteronomy and Genesis? Why would the pushing to the ends of the earth of the people of Israel be anything different in Deuteronomy than it is in Jesus in the Gospels when he commissions them to go out to the very ends of the earth, to the four corners of the earth to gather his elect? This is the whole point. It makes no sense for Paul to switch that up, change that story, but yet be so very close to the original story in terms of what he says. That just doesn't work. That's crazy. It's got to be consistent. It's got to work. And it does. Okay? It does. So, it's pretty clear that we have a case, right? A very, very strong case. And it's unfortunate that people don't know about it, because it's something that really, really kind of clicks everything, brings it all together for you. And you can just read it and not be affected by it, not think it's speaking of you. It's very liberating to not have to be in that me scenario all the time and understand it for what it is. Now, for those who have heard my teachings on Revelation 7, you know that I've, since today, have held a view that the sealed of Israel, 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe, is symbolic, right? That's clear. We know that this is all symbolic. But we also know that my view is that in verse 9, where John turns and sees a great multitude that no one could number, of all tribes, nations, tongues, and peoples, clothed in white robes, it's been my view that that is just another way of looking at the 144,000. So you have the beginning, verses 1 through 8 in Revelation 7, speaking of who they are, right? It gives the identity of them. 12,000 from this tribe, 12,000 from that tribe. But you'll notice that Ephraim is missing. And it wouldn't be so bad if Joseph was there, but Manasseh is there as well. So that means that Ephraim, the one that was said to become super great, pushed out to the tens of thousands, Ephraim is missing from that list in Revelation 7, verse 1 to 8. Why? Why is he the only one missing? Well, I'm sort of converting myself by way of logic and being honest and being reasonable And I'm not there fully because I take my time when coming to conclusions. I'll need to see more evidence, but I'm sort of leaning a little bit now in the direction of verse 9, speaking of Ephraim. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, crying out, salvation belongs to our God. In terms of fitting in with Deuteronomy chapter 33 and the song of Moses, or the promise of Moses at his death, this actually works. Right? In terms of fitting in with Genesis 48 and what it says about Ephraim and what he would become there, a fullness of nations, this actually works. In terms of fitting in with what Paul says in Romans 11, that in order for all Israel to be saved, the fullness of the nations had to come in. This actually works. So I'm not saying I'm there completely, right? I'm still leaving the door open, but you have to have a place for Ephraim, because Ephraim was part of the promise. And Ephraim was actually promised to become perhaps the greatest in number out of any of the tribes. Certainly, I should say. So it just makes sense that this great multitude that no one could number, coming from all these nations, peoples, and tongues, which fulfills what I just said and showed you from Genesis and Deuteronomy about how Ephraim would be pushed and become all different, lands. What does it say? Let me go back here. He shall push the peoples to the ends of the earth. That's spreading language. That's dispersing language. And that's exactly what the story shows as happening. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed this, how I tied all that up together for you. I hope you can see how anyone who tells you that you can't have symmetry in the start and end of the story is crazy. They're nuts, right? Of course you have symmetry. You have the garden curse in the beginning. You have the garden curse going away at the end. Of course there is symmetry in this story, beginning and an end. Okay? And so that's exactly all I needed to share today regarding Ephraim, regarding the great multitude. Things are clicking. That's what happens when you're in the right view. When you're in the wrong view, things don't click. You have to force things. There's confusion. There's, error. When you're in the right view, things click. Things make sense. It works out problematic passages. And that's all I'm ever here to do, is just figure things out and have clarity. So, folks, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like-a-rooski. If not, take a hike-a-rooski. Really, let's get this thing shared. Share it out there. Like it. Comment. Get some action on it so it shows up in the old algorithm. And we'll catch you on that next time. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.